The world is reduced to a vibration, a deep metallic rhythm felt in the bones before it is heard by the ears. It is the heartbeat of the armored train Ilya Muromets. A monster of welded steel and grim purpose, it emerges from the dawn mist not like a vehicle, but like a moving section of fortress wall. Fresh, dark green paint barely conceals older scars and the frantic repairs of previous engagements. Its main armament, 2 naval turrets with long, sinister 100mm barrels, are alien artifacts transplanted from a warship onto the flat, endless landscape. They are trained forward, sleeping giants. Inside the armored command car, the air is a soup of coal dust, machine oil, and intense concentration. Captain Anatoly Volkov does not simply stand. He is anchored to the rolling floor, his posture that of a ship's captain on a storm-tossed bridge. His eyes, pale blue and etched with permanent squint lines from a lifetime of scanning horizons, are fixed on the map unfurled before him. One hand rests on the cold steel of a speaking tube. The other traces a railway line that looks like a frail thread against the vastness of the front. He was a first-rank gunner on the battleship Marat. Now his battleship rides the steps. Every jolt of the chassis, every change in the engine's roar, is a language he understands instinctively. He listens to the train's sounds the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, diagnosing fatigue, stress, potential failure. Forward. In the converted locomotive, Lieutenant Sasha Koval has his ear pressed against a bulkhead, ignoring the blistering heat from the boiler. He is young, his face smudged with grease, but his eyes hold the sharp, calculating focus of a master engineer. He is not just driving the train, he is in a constant, silent dialogue with it. He feels a faint, new shudder in the drive shaft, a worry. He hears a valve hissing at a slightly wrong pitch, a note out of tune in his symphony of steam and pressure. For him, the Muromets is not a weapon first, but a profoundly complex, barely tamed machine. His war is against friction, metal fatigue, and entropy. He knows that out here, a broken coupling is as lethal as a German shell. In the radio compartment, the world is one of crackling static and urgent, fragmented voices. Petty Officer Vera, her headset clamping down on hair cropped short for practicality, is the nerve center. She is 18, but her youth is encased in a shell of severe professionalism. Her fingers, fine and delicate, constantly adjust knobs, fine-tuning the chaos of the ether into intelligible signals. She decodes coordinates, weather reports, casualty figures. The voices in her ears are strained, scared, sometimes suddenly silent. She has learned to listen to the silence between the words, to the fear in a dispatcher's breath. A part of her is always braced for the one message that concerns them directly, the one that will change their course from routine patrol to the center of the storm. The crew of 40 moves through the narrow, shadowy corridors of their steel home with the automatic grace of seasoned sailors. In the artillery magazine, men stripped to the waist, muscles slick with sweat, form a human chain, moving heavy, oily shells with a terrifying, respectful care. In the mess, a cook uses his body to brace against the violent sway, flipping pancakes on a griddle bolted to the floor. 2 gunners play a silent game of chess, the pieces held in place by a magnetic board. A young loader sleeps fitfully in his hammock, his face twitching with a private dream. This is their universe, a self-contained world of noise, heat, and relentless motion. Their safety has always been in that motion, in being a ghost on the rails, never where the enemy expects. Outside the thick, slitted armor glass windows, the world bleeds past. A burned-out village, skeletons of houses against the sky. A patch of sunflowers, miraculously untouched, turning their faces to the sun. Then a shattered forest, trees splintered and blackened. The war is not a front line. It is a disease on the land, and they are moving through its scar tissue. The distant, muffled thump of artillery is the baseline of their existence. Vera's voice, sharp and clear, cuts through the intercom system, severing the routine. It is not the usual background chatter. It carries a specific metallic tone of a priority alert from Army headquarters. The words are technical: grid coordinates, enemy unit designations, a request for immediate fire support. But the subtext screams from her controlled delivery. A crisis, a breach, a defensive line trembling like a leaf. They are the nearest heavy asset. The Ilya Muromets is ordered to proceed at maximum speed to grid point Delta 7 and stabilize the situation. In the command car, Captain Volkov's face hardens. The coordinates are in a sector known for soft ground and inadequate secondary tracks. A poor place for a giant. He does not hesitate. His order into the speaking tube is a low growl, devoid of question. Maximum combat speed. Now. The train's character transforms instantly. The deep, rhythmic clatter of wheels explodes into a frenzied, deafening drum roll. The locomotive, under Koval's urgent ministrations, unleashes a torrent of black smoke. The gentle, predictable sway becomes a violent, surging lurch. Objects, not secured, skid and crash. The chessboard flies, pieces scattering. The sleeping loader is thrown from his hammock. Anatoly Volkov braces himself against the map table, his eyes no longer on the paper, but on the track ahead, rapidly devoured by their momentum. The peaceful, rolling fortress has vanished. What surges forward now is something else entirely. A projectile of immense mass and fury, launched down a steel barrel towards the heart of the inferno. The faces of the crew tighten, all personal thought extinguished, replaced by the stark, simple arithmetic of combat. They are no longer traveling. They are being hurled. The world on the other side of the line is one of precise order and cold calculation. It exists not in the rattling, sweating belly of a steel behemoth, but in the sterile quiet of a command half-track, parked under a canopy of camouflage netting in a birch grove. The air here smells of gasoline, damp earth, and fresh ink from situation maps. There is no coal dust, only the faint, clean scent of gun oil. Oberleutnant Erich von Hausen does not look like a predator. He is a man of meticulous calm, his uniform impeccably tailored even in the field, his gloves spotless. He stands before a large tactical map pinned to a board, his posture erect, a monocular hanging from his neck like an instrument of a surgeon. His eyes, a pale, almost colorless gray, absorb the details of the map, the blue lines of retreating Soviet units, the red arrows of German advances, the thin, black capillaries of railways. He does not see landscapes. He sees geometry. Terrain is reduced to gradients, cover, and fields of fire. Forests are kill zones or concealment. Villages are strong points or obstacles. His command, the 2nd Platoon of the 51st Panzer Battalion, is a mere 5 machines on the map. But they are not just tanks. They are the new blood, the technological answer to the Soviet T-34. They are Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panthers. In the dappled light of the grove, one of them sits, engine cold for now. Its silhouette is all sloped armor and brutal functional angles. The long, overhanging barrel of its 75mm KWK-42 cannon gives it a lean, hungry profile. It is not a machine of passion. It is a machine of pure ballistic calculus, designed to kill at distances where the enemy cannot yet see you. Von Hausen's men move with a different rhythm than the Soviet crew. Their motions are economical, reserved. They polish viewports, check track tension, meticulously clean the already spotless bore of their cannon with long rods. There is no banter, only low, technical exchanges. They are not a family. They are a crew, a component of a larger, perfectly engineered system. Their confidence is not born from camaraderie, but from the deep, unshakable belief in their machine's superiority. They have seen what its tungsten cored shell does to a T-34 at 1,500 meters. A clean, deadly puncture, followed by a secondary explosion that tears the enemy tank apart from the inside. It is a clinical process. A motorcycle courier, dust-caked and frantic, disrupts the quiet. He delivers a sealed envelope. Von Hausen takes it, slices it open with a fingernail, and reads the typed orders without a change in expression. The High Command has identified a critical vulnerability. A key Soviet railway junction, codenamed Knotenpunkt Adler, supplies the entire northern flank of the defensive bulge. Its artillery and reinforcements flow along that single steel thread. The order is not for a frontal assault. It is for a deep, surgical strike. The second platoon, leveraging the Panther's speed and firepower, is to disengage from the main push, swing wide through a sector believed to be only lightly held, and sever that railway line. They are to be a scalpel, not a hammer. A faint, almost imperceptible light ignites in von Hausen's gray eyes. This is the kind of mission he was made for. Independent, decisive, relying on precision and nerve rather than brute force. He turns to his platoon sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Brandt with a face like tanned leather. No words are needed. Brandt sees the look and gives a single sharp nod. The order is transmitted not with a shout, but with a raised hand and a series of crisp, practiced gestures. The grove erupts into a controlled frenzy of a different kind. The quiet is shattered by the sudden, guttural roar of Maybach 512 engines coughing to life. Thick blue diesel smoke briefly clouds the air. Hatches clang shut with a sound of finality. Inside the lead Panther, von Hausen's world becomes one of muted green light from the vision blocks, the smell of hot electronics and sweat, the constant vibration of the idling engine. He puts on his radio headset, his voice calm and clear as he issues coordinates to his other 4 tanks. They do not charge, they flow. The massive tanks, 70 tons of steel each, move with a surprising predatory grace out of the grove and onto a dirt track. Their wide tracks churn the earth, but their movement is smooth, purposeful. They are not racing. They are stalking. Von Hausen, peering through his commander's periscope, scans the horizon. He sees the same devastated landscape, the burned farms, the shattered trees, but he catalogs it as potential ambush sites, covered approaches, hull-down positions. His mind is already several kilometers ahead, visualizing the railway embankment. He calculates the optimal angle of approach, the placement of his tanks to cover each other with interlocking fields of fire, the specific type of shell, high explosive surely, required to twist the rails beyond quick repair. He anticipates token resistance, perhaps a platoon of infantry or an antiquated anti-tank gun. These are variables in an equation he has solved many times before. The Panther's armor will shrug off small arms. Its optics will find the enemy long before they are seen. Its cannon will eliminate them with one shot. As his platoon advances, a column of dark giants moving through the golden morning haze, there is no sense of impending drama. There is only the hum of the engine, the crackle of the radio confirming positions, and the absolute, cold certainty of a master craftsman setting out to perform a familiar, demanding task. He is not heading into battle. He is proceeding to a work site. The demolition of a railway line is a technical problem. Any living beings who get in the way are merely additional factors to be neutralized with the same detached efficiency. The steel claws have been unsheathed, and they are moving silently, relentlessly, toward what they believe is an unsuspecting, static target. A new, terrible harmony screamed into existence. It was not the rhythmic percussion of wheels on rails, nor the deep, mechanical breath of the engine. It was a shriek of tortured metal, a sound so profoundly wrong it bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the stomachs of every man aboard, the Ilya Muromets. The world dissolved into a chaos of violent, physics-defying motion. It began with a sickening lurch, a feeling of the solid steel floor dropping away beneath their feet. The forward locomotive, thundering at suicidal speed, hit the compromised section of track. The carefully laid trap, dynamited sleepers and rails bent just enough, did its work with merciless efficiency. The lead wheels lost their purchase, clawing at air for a fraction of a second, before digging into the soft, rotten ballast. For Captain Volkov, time fragmented. One moment he was braced at his station, the map of the urgent destination burned into his mind. The next, he was a rag doll in a spinning steel room. The command car behind the tender bucked like a wild horse. He was thrown against a hardened steel bulkhead, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a silent gasp. The world upended. The ceiling became the wall, then the floor. Metal screamed. Glass exploded inward in a lethal blizzard of shards. A torrent of maps, tools, and loose equipment became a whirlwind of projectiles. A heavy fire extinguisher broke its moorings and flew across the compartment, smashing into the radio console in a shower of sparks. In the locomotive, Lieutenant Koval's intimate dialogue with his machine turned into a scream of betrayal. He felt the vibrations shift from a powerful hum to a panicked shudder, then to a catastrophic, bone-jarring series of impacts. The control levers were ripped from his hands. The boiler, that heart of pressurized steam, groaned in agony. A spray of scalding hot water and steam erupted from a ruptured pipe, filling the cab with a blinding, flesh-searing fog. He was thrown forward, his head connecting with the edge of the instrument panel. A flash of white pain, then a descending curtain of darkness, as the entire multi-ton mass of the engine slewed sideways, plowing a deep, ugly furrow into the earth, before coming to a stop canted at a 45-degree angle. In the artillery cars, chaos was absolute. The massive naval turrets, designed to pivot smoothly on greased gears, became uncontrollable pendulums of solid steel. They tore through their retaining rings with the sound of shearing cathedral bolts. One gun barrel slammed against its armored housing, bending with a groan that was almost organic. Men who were seconds before moving shells with ritualistic care were now tossed like dolls. A loader was crushed instantly when a shell storage rack tore loose from the wall and pinned him, the air filled with the choking dust of shattered concrete ballast used for counterweight, and the coppery scent of fresh blood. Petty Officer Vera's world of coded signals became a cacophony of pure noise. The radio compartment was a vortex of splintering wood, shearing metal, and the deafening roar of the derailment. Her headset was ripped away, the cord snapping. She was flung from her chair, her body colliding with the shuddering wall of the car as it tipped. She felt a rib give way with a sickening crunch. The carefully maintained console erupted in a fountain of electrical sparks, tubes bursting, dials shattering. The last thing she heard from her equipment was a final, dying shriek of feedback before it went dead, plunging her into a relative silence filled with moans, crackling flames, and the settling groan of wreckage. The train did not stop cleanly. It was a process of annihilation. Carriages jackknifed, slamming into one another with colossal force. The rear armored wagon, still carrying momentum, rode up and over the one before it, its wheels spinning uselessly in the air. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous, grinding, tearing symphony of destruction that seemed to last for minutes, but was over in 20 terrible seconds. Then a new, ominous sound emerged, the hiss of escaping steam from the dying locomotive. A sound like a great beast's final, ragged exhalation. It was punctuated by smaller, more intimate horrors. The crackle of electrical fires starting in broken wiring, the drip of precious water and fuel, and the low, pained cries of the wounded. Silence did not fall. It settled, thick and heavy as the dust that now swirled in the beams of sunlight cutting through torn armor plate. Anatoly Volkov pushed himself up from the debris, his uniform torn, blood trickling from a gash on his temple. He blinked, his ears ringing, his vision swimming. He stumbled to what was now a jagged hole where the armored window had been. The sight that greeted him was one of utter ruin. His mighty Ilya Muromets, his land battleship, was a broken-backed carcass sprawled across a field. It lay at impossible angles, some cars still tenuously linked, others twisted into abstract metal sculptures. Smoke rose from several points. The proud naval turrets were askew, one pointing uselessly at the ground, the other jammed sideways. And beyond the wreckage, the landscape was peaceful. A vast, open field stretched to a distant tree line. The sky was a serene, indifferent blue. They were utterly, completely exposed. No cover, no concealment. A steel island in a sea of grass. His mind, trained for combat, cut through the shock and pain with a single ice-cold realization. They were no longer hunters, no longer the mobile terror of the rails. They were prey. A stationary, wounded, incredibly valuable prize. And in this sector, the enemy owned the sky and the ground. The message Vera had received, the coordinates, the rush, it had all been part of a funnel, leading them to this exact, vulnerable point. They were not just wrecked. They were trapped. Pain was a constant low hum in the background, but it was a luxury Captain Volkov could not afford. The immediate animal instinct was to flee the twisted metal coffin, to scatter into the field and run. He crushed it. Flight meant death in the open. The wreckage of the Ilya Muromets, for all its ruin, was still the only hard cover for kilometers. Their fortress had fallen, but its walls, however crumpled, still stood. He moved through the devastation, his boots crunching on glass and splintered wood. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a grim, mechanical clarity. He saw the wounded. A young gunner cradled a shattered arm, his face pale with shock. Another man lay still, covered by a jacket placed gently over his face by a comrade. Volkov's jaw tightened. He forced himself to count, to assess. Perhaps 30, still standing. Many bleeding, all shell-shocked. Lieutenant Koval emerged from the steam-shrouded wreckage of the locomotive, a bloody bandage wrapped around his head, one arm held stiffly. His engineer's eyes were not on the dead, but on the structure of the cars, calculating stresses, weak points, possibilities. Then from the radio car, now a compressed cube of metal, they pulled Petty Officer Vera. She was conscious, her face a mask of pain, breath coming in short, sharp gasps from her injured ribs. But in her hands, clutched like a holy relic, was the mangled but potentially salvageable core of her radio transmitter. Her look to Volkov was not one of fear, but a fierce, defiant question. What now? The answer came not as an inspiration, but as the only logical conclusion, a cold, tactical analysis of their hellish situation. They had food, water for a day. They had a small mountain of ammunition, though much of it was scattered. Most critically, they had the guns. The forward 100mm naval turret was jammed, its mechanism warped. But the rear turret, though canted at a strange angle, responded to manual hydraulic override with a groan of protest. The heavy anti-aircraft cannons, the 37mm autocannons, were intact, and the machine guns, dozens of them. Volkov gathered the able-bodied. His voice was a ragged scrape, but it carried. He did not speak of hope or survival. He spoke of geometry and ballistics. They were no longer an armored train. They were a strong point, a fortress that had, through catastrophe, been deposited in a defensive position it never intended to hold. Their mission had not changed, to deny this sector to the enemy. They would just do it from right here. A frantic energy, born of desperation, seized the crew. This was no longer about running a machine. It was about reshaping a battlefield. Lieutenant Koval became a demon of engineering. His world narrowed to leverage, counterweight, and stability. Using shattered beams, torn-up railroad ties from the wreckage and brute strength, his teams began to fortify. They dug shallow firing pits around the perimeter, not for men, but for the dismounted heavy machine guns, creating interlocking fields of fire across the flat approaches. They shoved earth and debris against the most exposed sides of the derailed cars, creating makeshift berms to deflect lower-angle tank fire. They scuttled like ants through the wreckage, recovering shells from ruptured storage, piling them near the guns, creating new, perilous ammunition dumps. Petty Officer Vera, refusing to be moved to a first aid post, worked in a haze of pain. In the comparative shelter of a tipped-over car, she and a helper with knowledge of electronics began the painstaking resurrection of the radio. It was a puzzle of broken connections, shattered vacuum tubes scavenged from other equipment, and sheer will. Her ears, trained for the faintest signal, now listened for the telltale hum of power, the crackle of a live connection. They needed to tell someone they were here. They needed to know if anyone was coming. Volkov's focus was the main gun. Climbing into the skewed rear turret was like entering a funhouse mirror version of his former domain. The floor was tilted. The optics were misaligned. Using a wrench and a sledgehammer, he and his gunners manually forced the turret's rotation gear just enough to unlock it. They couldn't traverse smoothly, but they could now aim in a rough, 60-degree arc across the most likely avenue of approach from the main road. He calculated firing solutions in his head, compensating for the list of the car, estimating how the uneven ground would affect the massive weapon's recoil. This was not naval gunnery. This was point-blank brawling with a dinosaur. He distributed his few anti-tank weapons, the precious RPG-43 grenades, the bottles of flammable mixture for makeshift incendiaries. He positioned his best snipers and riflemen in the higher intact sections of the cars. Their job to watch for infantry, to target vision slits, to be the eyes of the fortress. As the sun climbed higher, a transformation took place. The chaotic scatter of wreckage began to take on a malevolent order. Machine gun nests covered blind spots. The formidable snout of the naval cannon now protruded from a nest of torn earth and splintered timber, no longer elegant, but brutish and purposeful. The train was dead, but its corpse was being weaponized. Every man knew the math. They had no armor on their flanks. Their fortress walls would not stop a dedicated tank shell. They were a bluff, a porcupine, hoping to look like a dragon. The final chilling piece of the puzzle fell into place when a lookout whispered down from his perch. Dust, a distant plume on the horizon, moving against the wind, from the direction of the German advance. It was too far to identify, but its path was unmistakable. It was following the line of a secondary road that led directly to the wide open field that now served as their killing ground. Captain Volkov looked at his watch. They had perhaps 30 minutes. He took one last look at his domain, the blood-stained steel, the exhausted men taking their positions, the absurd, glorious bulk of the naval gun aimed at an empty field. The Ilya Muromets would not move again, but it would fight. The trap was set. Now they waited to see what it had caught. The plume of dust solidified into a shape, then two shapes. Not the low, predatory silhouettes of panthers, but the taller, more angular form of German reconnaissance vehicles. A SDKFZ 234 armored car, its 8 wheels churning up the dirt road, followed at a distance by a smaller motorcycle with a sidecar. A probing finger, not a clenched fist. They advanced with cautious arrogance, stopping a kilometer out on the road's edge just where the field began. Inside the wreck, every breath was held. Men pressed themselves against cold steel, peering through cracks, over sights, through periscopes salvaged from the dead. Captain Volkov, crammed in his canted turret, watched through the commander's damaged scope. He saw the commander of the armored car, a figure in a black panzer uniform, standing tall in the open hatch, raising binoculars, scanning the bizarre, tragic spectacle of the derailed train. The man's posture spoke of curiosity, not alarm. A target of opportunity. A crippled prize to be reported, perhaps later picked over by infantry. Volkov's mind worked with frigid precision. Firing the main gun was unthinkable. It would be like using a sledgehammer to swat a fly. Wasteful. And it would reveal their trump card's precise location and capability to whatever larger force was behind this scout. The anti-aircraft autocannons were a possibility, but their high-velocity crack would also signal serious resistance. He needed a response that was a whisper, not a shout. A sting, not a roar. He needed them to underestimate. His order passed through the train in a series of hand signals, a silent language they had drilled but never used in such deadly earnest. The crew of the closest 37mm anti-aircraft gun, now repurposed as a ground weapon, adjusted their aim with agonizing slowness. The gun's shield was partially camouflaged with a torn, muddy tarpaulin. The gunner, a man who had once tracked screaming Stukas, now tracked the slow, almost stationary armored car. He calculated windage from the swaying grass, range by the marked posts on the sight. He had mentally recalibrated for ground targets. He waited. The German commander lowered his binoculars, seemingly turning to speak to his driver. A moment of perfect complacency. The sound that shattered the pastoral silence was not the deep-throated blast they were used to, but a sharp, vicious crack, crack, crack of the automatic cannon. 3 rounds in a controlled burst. Time seemed to stretch. The first shell kicked up a geyser of dirt and road gravel just meters in front of the armored car's hood. A warning shot gone awry, or so it would seem. The second and third rounds found their mark. They struck not the heavily sloped front armor, but the thinner side plating just below the commander's hatch. The sound of impact was a pair of metallic shrieks. Sparks flew. The German commander vanished as if yanked down by an invisible hand. A spray of dark fluid, oil, not blood, arced from a punctured reservoir. The armored car shuddered. Its machine gun, operated by a crewman in panic, fired a long, unaimed burst in the general direction of the train, the rounds pinging harmlessly off the thick frontal armor of the lead cars or whining over the field. Inside the train, the Soviet crew did not cheer. They froze, waiting for the thunderous response. It did not come. The motorcycle immediately executed a frantic, skidding turn and sped back the way it had come, a messenger of shock. The damaged armored car, belching smoke, lurched into reverse, then awkwardly turned, presenting its less damaged flank, and began retreating at a limping, humiliated pace. It left behind a trail of black oil and a profound, echoing silence. The silence was more terrifying than the gunfire. Volkov knew this was not a victory. It was an alarm bell they had been forced to ring. He had swatted the probing finger, but the brain behind it was now fully aware. The Germans now knew the wreck was not just a wreck. It was armed. It was hostile. It had teeth. But what kind of teeth? A lone, desperate anti-aircraft gun? A full crew with heavy weapons? The retreating scout would report an ambush, but the scale of it would be a mystery. He had bought time, but he had also escalated the confrontation from a possible surrender to a guaranteed assault. Lieutenant Koval used the precious minutes of the lull not to celebrate, but to reinforce. The burst of gunfire had given away the approximate position of one of their autocannons. He directed men to shift sandbags, to create a dummy position a dozen meters away, hoping to draw future fire. He checked the improvised bracings on the main gun turret, which had shuddered from the nearby concussions of their own weapon. Petty Officer Vera, her face beaded with sweat from pain and concentration, finally elicited a weak, fluctuating hum from the radio's speaker. It was life. She began the slow, arduous process of tapping out a message in Morse code, her breath catching with every stab of pain from her ribs. The message was a stark, unadorned fact, repeated into the void. Coordinates. Status: immobilized, but combat ready. Request immediate support or air cover. She had no idea if the signal was piercing the static of the front, if anyone was listening. She sent it into the ether like a prayer. The crew's initial surge of adrenaline from the successful engagement ebbed, leaving behind a colder, sharper dread. They had drawn first blood. They had announced their presence. Now, They had to wait for the inevitable, proper response. The men at their positions scanned the horizon with renewed intensity, knowing the next dust cloud would not be from a lone scout car. The field before them, empty and sun-drenched, was no longer just a field. It was a chessboard, and they had just made their first irrevocable move. The opening gambit was over. The real game, a game against an opponent they could not see but whose power they could all too easily imagine, was about to begin. The taste of oil and cordite in the air was now mixed with the metallic flavor of impending storm. The response did not come as a thunderclap, but as a vibration. A deep, dissonant hum felt through the ground before it was heard, transmitted from the earth into the steel bones of the wreck and up into the spines of the men waiting inside. It was not the sound of one engine, but of several, harmonizing into a single, predatory drone. No dust cloud appeared this time. The Germans had left the road. They were moving across country, using folds in the land, patches of scorched orchard, the skeletal remains of a farmstead for concealment. They were learning. On the raised observation post they had fashioned from the roof of an overturned carriage, the lookout's voice was a dry rasp over the field telephone. He reported glimpses, not targets. A flicker of dark movement behind a distant hedgerow, the brief, sun-reflected glint off a commander's periscope 800 meters to the southeast. The slow, deliberate crushing of underbrush. They were being surrounded, not frontally assaulted. The enemy was taking its time, measuring them. Inside his skewed turret, Captain Volkov sweated. His world was the narrow, circular view through the gun sight. The panoramic vision of a ship's commander was gone, replaced by a tunnel. He could see a slice of the field, a fragment of the distant tree line. He was blind to his flanks, reliant on the frantic, whispered reports coming via the improvised phone line from the lookout. The tension was not of imminent explosion, but of exquisite, tightening pressure. They were a cornered animal, and the hunter was circling, studying its reflexes. The first shot, when it came, was from nowhere. A sharp, supersonic crack overhead, followed instantly by a deafening, catastrophic explosion against the thick frontal armor of the forward artillery car. The impact was not a ping, it was a colossal hammer blow that shook the entire structure. Shards of internal lining and sparks rained down on the men huddled within. It was a 75mm armor-piercing round from a Panther, fired from extreme range, a probing shot to test their armor, to gauge reaction. It did not penetrate, but it left a massive, glowing dent and a spiderweb of cracks in the hardened steel. The message was clear. We can hit you from where you cannot see us. Chaos threatened. Men ducked instinctively. A young loader near the impact zone screamed, clutching his ears from the concussion. Lieutenant Koval, moving through the central corridor, shouted for calm, his voice raw. This was the test. To return fire wildly was to waste ammunition and reveal more positions. Volkov's order was choked but clear. Hold discipline. Only the lookout, with his elevated view, could guide them. Minutes stretched, each second a wire drawn taut. Then, from a new angle, roughly northeast, another shot. This one was lower, aimed at the base of the derailed locomotive. It struck the thick metal of the tender, tearing open a coal bunker in a great black cloud. A third shot, from almost due east, slammed into the earthen berm they had piled against the command car, detonating with a geyser of dirt, partially collapsing their makeshift fortification. They were being triangulated. 3 different firing positions. The Panthers were using their superior optics and range to methodically dissect the wreck from a safe distance. They were not rushing. They were conducting a brutal, clinical analysis. Each shot gathered data: armor thickness, possible weak spots, the location of return fire. The Soviet crew's helplessness was a physical agony. Then, the lookout's voice, cracking with urgency, gave a grid. A smudge of exhaust, a low silhouette partially hull down behind a gentle rise at 1,100 meters. Volkov's world shrank to his gun sight. His gunners, muscles straining against the manual controls, began the laborious process of traversing the massive naval cannon. The turret groaned in protest, metal scraping on metal. They were aiming not at a tank, but at a map coordinate, at a patch of earth. Calculations of range, of the gun's list, of wind were made in frantic whispers. It was guesswork, elevated to a lethal art. Volkov gave the command. The blast of the 100-millimeter naval gun was apocalyptic inside the confined space. The entire wreck seemed to jump sideways, settling back with a groan of tortured metal. The sound was not a sharp crack, but a deep, volumetric boom that rolled across the field like the wrath of God. Through the settling dust and smoke, Volkov saw the distant rise erupt in a towering column of black soil and fire. No secondary explosion. A near miss or a clean miss. But the effect was instantaneous. The German sniper fire ceased. The predatory hum of engines changed pitch, shifting location. The psychological equation had altered. The wounded beast had just roared, and its roar carried the weight of naval artillery. The message was received. This was not merely an armored train. It was a stationary, but fully armed, coastal defense battery. The cost was immediate. The violent recoil of their own gun, on unstable ground, had worsened the structural damage. A support beam in the turret housing buckled with a sound of shearing iron. A network of cracks spread across the interior armor plate. They had revealed their fist, and in doing so, fractured their own wrist. Outside, the Panthers began to move again, but their pattern changed. No more static, hull-down sniping. Now they advanced in short, sharp bounds, one tank providing covering fire with precise, high-explosive shells aimed at their machine gun nests and observation posts, while another darted forward 100 meters to a new piece of cover. It was a relentless, professional closing of the net. They were no longer testing. They were executing. The field, once empty, was now alive with the deadly ballet of giants, closing in from multiple directions. The air grew thick with the smell of scorched earth, spent cordite, and the sharp, electric scent of high explosives. The duel had begun in earnest, and the opening moves had made one thing terrifyingly clear. The Soviets had one massive gun and a brittle shell of a position. The Germans had 5 mobile, perfectly coordinated hunters with all the time in the world to pick them apart. A jagged shard of hot metal, scything through the air from a near-miss high-explosive round, found its mark in Captain Volkov's command turret. It did not strike him cleanly. It ricocheted off the fractured interior wall with a demonic shriek, fragmenting into a spray of red-hot splinters that peppered his side and back. He was thrown forward against the cold steel of the breech block, a grunt of air and surprise forced from his lungs. Pain, white-hot and immediate, erupted along his right flank. He felt warmth soak through his tunic, a stark contrast to the cold sweat on his skin. His vision blurred, the already narrow world of the gun sight swimming into a haze of gray and red. He did not fall. He gripped the edge of the sight with trembling, blood-slicked hands, anchoring himself. To fall was to surrender the gun. To surrender the gun was death, for them all. He tried to issue an order, but his voice was a wet, choked rasp that did not carry. The gun crew stared at him, their faces masks of soot and terror, frozen by the sight of their captain bleeding out against their weapon. Through the thickening fog in his mind, Volkov saw it. The critical flaw in their desperate geometry. A panther, more daring than the rest, had used the covering fire of its comrades to execute a wide, sweeping flanking maneuver. It was now emerging from a dry creek bed only 400 meters to the southwest, a distance that was practically point-blank for its long gun. It presented its formidable frontal armor, but more terrifyingly, it was angling to bring its side gun, the coaxial machine gun, to bear on the softer, exposed flank of the command car where the infantry and machine gunners were positioned. It was a move of cold brilliance. It would shred their supporting defense, then put a tank shell into their unprotected side at a range where even their naval gun would struggle to traverse in time. From his station near the shattered locomotive, Lieutenant Sasha Koval saw the same threat. He saw Volkov sagging in the turret. He saw the Panther grinding into its firing position. In that instant, the engineer's mind, trained to solve problems of force and structure, discarded every rule of conventional warfare. The plan that formed was not one of tactics, but of brutal physics. A desperate reconfiguration of their broken world. He did not hesitate. He moved, shouting for every able-bodied man not pinned down by fire. His voice, usually calm and technical, was a raw, commanding bark that cut through the din. He pointed not at the enemy, but at their own wreckage, at the rear artillery car, the one with the still functional but list-locked main gun. His idea was insane. It was glorious. They would not turn the gun. They would turn the car. Men stared at him as if he were mad. Then they moved. It was a frenzy of pure, adrenalized will. Under a storm of covering machine gun fire from the surviving Soviet positions, Koval led a team into the hail. They scrambled for the heavy steel railroad jacks used for lifting derailed rolling stock. They dragged them to the high side of the canted artillery car. Others, using entrenching tools, picks, even their bare hands, began frantically digging away the earth from under the suspended wheels on the low side, trying to create space to alter the balance. It was like trying to adjust the footing of a dying dinosaur. Koval himself, ignoring the snap and whine of bullets off the steel around him, wedged himself beneath the gargantuan frame. He placed a desperate, calculated charge of demolition explosive. Not to destroy, but to blast a crater under the high side, to drop it. He was an architect of chaos, betting their lives on a split-second calculation of force and mass. The explosion was a localized thunderclap. Dirt and metal fragments geysered. The massive car lurched, groaned, and settled, with a ground-shaking finality. It had moved, only a few degrees. But it was enough. Inside the wounded turret, Volkov, clinging to consciousness, felt the world shift. The angle of the floor changed minutely beneath his boots. He forced his eyes to the sight. The traverse gear, previously jammed, now had a sliver of new clearance. It was not freedom, but it was possibility. With a superhuman effort fueled by agony and rage, he threw his weight against the manual traverse lever. His gunners, seeing their captain's impossible act, joined him. Muscles corded, teeth gritted, they fought the tons of frozen metal. It gave, it moved. The great barrel began to swing, achingly slow, like the minute hand of a clock made for gods, towards the flanking Panther. The German tank commander, seeing the impossible, the entire wrecked carriage shifting, the long naval gun beginning to track him, reacted with professional speed. His turret began to traverse faster, much faster, to meet this new threat. It was a race of hydraulics against bleeding human muscle. Volkov's world narrowed to the crosshairs. He did not see the Panther. He saw a targeting solution. He compensated for the list, for his own trembling, for the dark spots crowding his vision. He ignored the frantic adjustments of his gunner. This was his shot. From the Baltic to this damned field, it was always his shot. He fired. The blast was cataclysmic. In the confined, wounded space, it was a sound beyond sound. A pressure that felt like the sky collapsing. The already compromised turret ring split with a horrific metallic scream. But outside, the effect was apocalyptic. The 100mm naval shell, designed to pierce the belt armor of a cruiser, struck the Panther not on its thick frontal glacis, but on the junction between hull and turret as it was still turning. At this range, with this kinetic energy, armor was a suggestion. The impact was not a penetration. It was an annihilation. The Panther's turret was ripped from its ring in a volcanic eruption of orange fire and black smoke, cartwheeling backwards through the air in a grotesque, slow-motion ballet. The hull shuddered, vomited flame from every hatch, and sat burning like a pagan offering. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. The German fire ceased, stunned into hiatus by the shocking spectacle. On the Soviet side, there was no cheer. There was only the heavy breathing of exhausted men, the moan of the wounded, the crackle of the dying tank's funeral pyre, and the slow, final slump of Captain Anatoly Volkov's body against the breech of his gun, his hand still resting on the firing lever, his eyes closed. The price was displayed in the ruin of their turret, in the still forms in the mud, and in the life bleeding out of their commander. They had slain a dragon, but the beast had cost them their heart. The world did not return to the roar of engines and the shriek of shells. An eerie, vibrating silence descended, broken only by the elemental sounds of destruction. The hungry crackle of flames consuming the Panther's carcass, the metallic pings of cooling steel, the low groan of the wreck settling deeper into its grave of earth and debris, and the ragged, desperate breathing of the survivors. The remaining German tanks had not fled. They had withdrawn, pulling back to a respectful, unseen distance. The brutal clinical execution had been interrupted by a demonstration of savage, sacrificial power. They were not retreating. They were reassessing, regrouping. The lull was tactical, not a reprieve. It was the quiet of a predator that has lost a claw, now circling more warily, looking for a new angle to tear the throat from wounded prey. Inside the shattered fortress, time moved with a thick, syrupy slowness. Lieutenant Sasha Koval, his face a mask of soot and someone else's blood, crawled from the wreckage of his improvised engineering miracle. His hands were raw and blistered, his uniform torn. He did not look at the burning tank. His eyes went immediately to the command turret, now a grotesque sculpture of twisted metal, its great gun frozen in its triumphant, final aim. He climbed into the ruin. Captain Volkov was alive, but only just. His breathing was shallow, a wet, whispering sound. Men had already reached him, applying rough field dressings that were quickly soaked through with dark red. His pale blue eyes were open, clouded with pain, but they found Koval's face. There was no command left in them, only a question, and a profound, weary transfer of trust. Koval gave a single sharp nod. "I have it." Volkov's gaze shifted slightly, toward the interior of the train, and then his eyes closed, his consciousness retreating to a place where the pain could be managed. Koval's new command was a kingdom of ruin. He moved through it, his engineer's mind now forced to calculate not stresses on metal, but the breaking point of men. He took a silent inventory. Less than 20 effectives. Ammunition for the main gun was down to 3 shells. The smaller guns had more, but they were running low. The machine gun nests were half silent, their crews dead or wounded. The air inside the cars was thick with the smells of blood, burnt powder, and the sweet, sickly odor of seared flesh. The wounded lay in the comparative shelter of the central corridor, their suffering a low, constant hum beneath the silence. They were no longer a military unit. They were the last defenders of a doomed keep. In the tipped-over radio car, Petty Officer Vera existed in a world of pure, white-hot agony. Every breath was a knife twisting in her chest. The mangled radio set before her was a beast she had to tame. Her vision swam, but her fingers, guided by a will that had detached from her broken body, continued their work. She had bypassed burnt-out circuits, scavenged a functional vacuum tube from a shattered amplifier, resoldered connections with hands that shook so badly she had to brace her wrists on the table. A faint, steady green glow now emanated from the power indicator, a tiny, miraculous ember of life. Outside, a new sound began to weave itself into the silence. Not engines. A low, distant drone from the west, growing slowly, steadily. Aircraft engines. The Germans were calling in the final arbiter, a Stuka dive bomber, or a flight of ground attack planes. The wreck of the Ilya Muromets was a perfect, immobile target. The last move in the game. The knights had been checked. The bishops were now coming. Vera heard the drone. It pierced the fog of her pain. She looked at her radio, at the glowing eye. It was alive. It could listen. But could it speak? She had to believe it could. She switched to the agreed-upon emergency frequency, her hand trembling as she keyed the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was not the clear, professional tone of a radio operator. It was a thin, strained whisper, forced through clenched teeth, each word costing her a lance of fire in her ribs. She did not send a plea. She did not request repeat instructions. She uttered a statement of fact, a testament. She gave their coordinates, the call sign of the Ilya Muromets, and then, with the last of her breath, she painted the picture. Mission ongoing. Railway interdiction failed. Position held. She repeated it, a fragile mantra against the growing thunder in the sky, until a coughing fit seized her, doubling her over the console, her vision tunneling to the single, glowing light. On the horizon, black specks resolved into shapes, not the angular silhouettes of German aircraft, but the broader, double-tailed profiles of Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix, flying low and fast, their engines now a roaring promise. They had been in the area, hunting. They had heard a ghost in the ether. Koval, standing in the open watching the approaching aircraft with a numb resignation, saw them bank, change formation. They were not lining up for a bombing run on the train. They were spreading out, searching the tree lines, the folds in the ground around the field. They had understood. The lead Il-2 tipped its wing, a flash of recognition. Then, with a shrieking howl of its siren, it dove not at the train, but beyond it, toward the concealed positions of the German tanks. Rockets streaked from its wings, stitching lines of fire and earth into the landscape where the Panthers hid. The field, once a silent killing ground, erupted again. But this time, the storm was falling on the hunters. Inside the radio car, Vera heard the new, blessed thunder of the Sturmovik's cannons through the torn hull. She managed one last weak press of the transmit button. No words this time, just 3 dots, 3 dashes. 3 dots in Morse code. The universal signal, not SOS but its successor. Mission accomplished. Her hand fell from the key. She slid from the chair, her back against the cold steel wall, listening to the symphony of salvation roaring overhead. She looked at the men being gently carried from the wreck, at Koval organizing a perimeter against an enemy now in frantic retreat, at the still form of Captain Volkov being lifted with utmost care. The Ilya Muromets would never ride the rails again. It was a corpse of steel, a tomb for some, a crucible for others. But in the vast, strategic calculus of the war, it had served its purpose. The railway line behind them remained unsevered. The German spearhead had been blunted, delayed, forced to bleed here in this anonymous field. The crew had not just survived. They had interposed their broken bodies and their will between the enemy and his objective. They had become, in their final, desperate act, the immovable object. And for now, in the smoke and the dying light, with the sound of friendly aircraft owning the sky, that was enough. It was victory.